invite you to continue hearing for God's word as recorded in Exodus chapter 14, verses 5 through 15. When the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, the minds of Pharaoh and his officials were changed towards the people, and they said, "What have we done letting Israel leave our service?" So he had his chariot made ready, and he took his army with him. He took 600 picked chariots and all the other chariots of Egypt with officers over all of them. The Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and he pursued the Israelites who were going out boldly. The Egyptians pursued them, all Pharaoh's horses and chariots, his chariot drivers and his army. They overtook them and camped by the sea, by Ahurarath, in front of Baal-Zephon. As Pharaoh drew near, the Israelites looked back, and there were the Egyptians, advancing on them. In great fear, the Israelites cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us, bringing us out of Egypt? Is this not the very thing we told you in Egypt? Let us alone and let us serve the Egyptians. For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness." But Moses said to the people, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm and see the deliverance that the Lord will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you have only to keep still." Then the Lord said to Moses, "Why do you cry out to me? Tell the Israelites to go forward." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Okay, so stop me if you've heard this one. Okay, now I'm thinking don't stop me because Ben has trained y'all well, and some of you might actually raise your hand to stop me. Don't stop me whether or not you've heard this one. A man found himself in a rushing flood and took shelter on his roof. He began to fervently pray, "God, I have faith, rescue me." Along came another fellow in a rowboat with a little neon rescue flag, and he said, "Hop in, sir, the waters are rising and I will not be able to make a second pass." The man paused his prayers long enough to decline. "God will save me. You go on." The fellow in the boat argued for a moment, but sensing coming danger, he was forced to paddle to safety. Some hours later, the water having risen enough for a boat to get through, a fan boat came along. The man who was manning the boat shouted over the waves, "Get in." Still praying, the man declined. "I have faith. God will rescue me. You go on." The waters rose and rose until they began to lap the roof that the man was sitting on. The man was praying and terrified, and he began to shout out for God's rescue. Now, I grew up around the water, and I spent many summers down in the Low Country savoring the wide beaches of Seabrook and the bustle of Charleston, which by the early 90s had been marked by its own flood. I'm no competitive swimmer, but I was confident enough not to be particularly concerned by the vast ocean and its changing tides, until one summer in college, when I found myself caught in a riptide off of Folly Beach. Now, I knew better than to fight the tide, but as I watched, the shore was getting further and further away, and I was terrified. When the ocean finally spit me up nearly a mile from where we had set up camp, I was winded and weary. The waters that I loved, that I trusted, were, I began to realize, also and always waters that threatened. All that to say, water. Water is an odd thing, isn't it? Contrarians will disagree with my usage, but it's a bit paradoxical in nature. Without water, we can't live. But too much of it will destroy us. So it is in scriptures too. When we remember water, what do we first remember? Most of us remember the wild flood that tossed Noah about and destroyed a good creation gone bad. But we also recall the promise of baptism, which we celebrated this morning, the water that cover a child's head, marking them as a member of Christ's household, of God's family forever. Somewhere between those two stories, a story of destruction on the one hand and of new life on the other, lies this story, the story of the miracle at the Red Sea. Oblivion for Egypt, salvation for Moses and the Hebrews. Back to the man and the roof and the coming flood. The man's prayers have just turned into cries. He is yelling out when suddenly, finally, the spotlight of a helicopter trains on him, and the rescuers throw down a ladder for him to climb. They climb it, they shout, "Get in!" They are mystified when he declines. Soon he's going to have to tread water. The storm is raging, but he refuses their pleas. "I have faith. God will save me. You go on." Those of us who have grown up in Sunday schools have the story of the Red Sea crossing imprinted on our minds. It's an odd one to tell children, but we do nonetheless. But it's not really only the church's story. It's also a cultural story. It's been depicted time and again in movies. Who can forget Charlton Heston with his mighty staff sending the waters, ripping on some unseen axis? Or, for those more comedically inclined, Monty Python's Brian yelling, "I'm a Red Sea pedestrian and proud of it." But all that familiarity may have dulled us to the terror of this scene. The Hebrews have been promised salvation from the horrors of the imperial machine, the horrors of slavery. And they escaped slavery narrowly. But Pharaoh grew to regret freeing the Hebrews. So while they were still close, Pharaoh sends his best-in-class army to pursue the ragtag Israelites, 600 chariots, and almost every officer in his army. While the former slaves, families, with young children and elderly folk walk, plod, carry on through the Egyptian wild, all Pharaoh's horses and all Pharaoh's men swiftly approach, ready to corral and attack. The Hebrews are between two impossible foes: the swirling, uncontrollable chaos of the waters and the ferocious, violent malice of a tyrannical leader. It is no wonder that they begin to cry out to Moses that he well should have left them to die in Egypt. Now, if you've been following along these past few weeks in worship, you know that we are in the midst of a sermon series called The Fabric of Faith. We've explored faith as friendship, faith as patience, and faith as letting go, among others. And you might be wondering if I have lost the, perhaps, thread that binds together our fabric of faith. But what interests me today is faith as a lived, experienced paradox. Oxford defines a paradox as a situation, person, or thing that combines contradictory features or qualities. Our Lord is both lamb and shepherd, for instance, a paradox par excellence. And he is both victor and slain, or an example perhaps more accessible to those of us on the other side of the millennia, we hold as a paradigm of faith, the Father, who, fearing his child's death, cries out to Jesus, "I believe, Lord. Help my unbelief. I believe. Help my unbelief." Paradox lies at the heart of our faith. We see it in the person of Christ, fully human and fully God. We see it in the leap of faith that requires from us trust without certainty. And we see it on the banks of the Red Sea as an army approaches. Addressing the fear of those who have followed him, Moses in verse 14 encourages steadfastness. He has heard from God that God will do some mighty and powerful deed, but he doesn't know what that is yet. The God who liberated will continue somehow to lead this march toward freedom. The Lord will fight for you, Moses tells the people. and you have only to keep still. Picture the scene again, the darkness, the chaos, all the noises of the army, the fear, the ocean lapping its mighty waves, and hear Moses' assurances. The Lord will fight for you, and you have only to keep still. When at the gates of heaven, the man who only moments ago had been surrounded by the waters of a flood began to argue with St. Peter. He was bewildered by his lot. He can't believe that he wasn't saved. I had faith, the man said. I had faith, and I knew that God would save me. I knew that God would rescue me. Why didn't God save me? What else would you have? Replies Peter. God sent a canoe, and when you declined that, God sent a fan boat. And then, after all those long hours, God sent a helicopter. Having declined, you find yourself here, between the man on the roof and the Israelites who are rightly afraid as they face the army of Pharaoh and the watery chaos of the sea. My mind can't help but turn to paradox. Moses assures the people that God will fight. They needn't raise their arms for this one. God's going to sub in. All they have to do is stay still. But if they are going to get across that sea and see the deliverance of the Lord, they also have to keep walking. Moses tells them, the Lord will fight for you, and you have only to keep still. And the Lord replies, tell the Israelites to go forward. Faith. Faith is the paradox that holds the crucified, resurrected King at its center. It is the paradox that believes amidst disbelief. It is the paradox of God's salvation in a fan boat driver, the paradox of baptism, death, and new life. It is the paradox that keeps still while putting one foot in front of the other, following right into the waves of the sea. Keep still. Get moving. A few weeks ago, I had the great honor of preaching at a pride service in Duke Divinity's Goodson Chapel. Now, I've been a Presbyterian, like so many of you, all of my life. I went to Presbyterian college. I was trained at a Presbyterian seminary, but Duke is just smack full of Methodists. And I know that there are some Methodists here with us today. There's a lot of them at Duke. And then there's this sort of healthy balance of Baptists. And somehow there are also Pentecostals. It's very confusing for a good Presbyterian. Now, the good thing is that this service was planned by a Presbyterian. It was all decent and in order, so I felt right at home. And I hit my stride in that sermon. I'm going to just tell y'all, I was really feeling that sermon, and I even heard a few amens. Ooh. And some people kept saying, And I would like to give thanks in this moment for those warm-hearted Methodists and those righteous Baptists. I could get used to that kind of positive feedback. And then I finished my sermon, and I said amen, and I went right back to my little place on the chancel, seated upright, looking very serious in my robe and preparing for the prayers. My friend Ryan, a pastor and community organizer who does his work in Louisville, got up to pray. He's a big guy, and he's a very serious-looking guy, and he strode to the center of the chancel, and I just assumed that he would keep following the order as I expected. Lead us through our everyday liturgy. Lord, in your mercy, hear our prayers. But I forgot one really critical and key thing about Ryan. He's a Baptist. And as he strode to the center of the chancel, he loudly pronounced that as a community organizer and a man of faith, he was a person who prayed not only with his voice, but with his feet. And for the prayers of the people, he asked that the worshipers get up. Can you imagine the horror? Then start talking to each other. I want you to think about what you would do if Ben Dorr asked you to do that in just a few minutes. I don't think y'all would know what to do. What do you need to pray for, he said. Whose work do you need to give thanks for by name? What do you need to confess to one another? Find someone you don't know. Walk around the chapel. Pray with your voices, but don't forget to pray with your feet. You have never seen someone so fervently try to melt into a Gothic stone column until you have seen a Presbyterian pastor in Goodson Chapel being asked to, number one, stand up without an asterisk in the bulletin. No, thank you. Number two, find a friend. Don't see any, can't do it. And number three, spontaneously pray while walking in the middle of a service. I would have gladly in that moment let the waves of the Red Sea just lap me right up. I am so comfortable in this place. I'm so comfortable in that lectern, in this pulpit. I feel so comfortable with all my well-planned piety and my nicely rehearsed prayers. And in that moment, I found myself paralyzed. And as I pulled myself off of the stone and walked to find a friend, I remembered the Hebrews, rightly afraid, far more righteously than I, afraid, embracing in their stillness their own salvation by moving their feet. The Lord fights for those we hold in prayer, and the Lord fights for us. I truly believe that. The Lord is also fighting, according to the psalmist, for those who are bent down low, for those who are in prison, for those who are struck by maladies, and for immigrants, and for orphans, and for widows. But while the Lord is fighting, bending the world to look more like the new heavens and the new earth, we faithful, by and through and in and despite our stillness, are required to get moving. Faithfulness, paradoxically, is not waiting for some God from the machine to come down and pluck us out of our fear, pluck us away from the banks of the river. It is trusting that the God who walks with us through the ocean will lead us despite it all. It is getting on your feet and following after the God who is always up ahead of us, the God of liberation and the God of the empty tomb. When they looked back, the Israelites who had been going out boldly only a moment ago, they saw the encroaching army. The threat was new and acute. How often, I wonder, do you find yourself held back from following because you're looking back? You're stuck in some nostalgia for the past, or caught between these two threatening poles that are immobilizing you. Having come to those types of crossroads, what do you find yourself inclined to do? Maybe, like me, you turn on Netflix and you just sort of burrow under the covers, hoping that it will all go away. Perhaps you attempt to take control for yourselves. I know some of y'all, I imagine that would be a reaction. Take control for yourselves. Maybe you deny your very real fear, hoping that by minimizing it, it will all just magically pass. Or you dwell in it, and you lose yourself to inconsolable angst. Do you see yourself in any of those scenarios, caught at your crossroads? Or do you? Can you, in those still moments, look for the God who is calling you through the sea? Put one foot in front of the other, no matter how difficult, no matter how full of muck and mire and flotsam and jetsam, and seek out the places where God has gone and where God is going. Now, sometimes in life, you might find yourself in the privileged position of being the fan boat driver, helping someone take one foot in front of them. And sometimes you might be the one needing rescue. Oftentimes, praise be to God, there's no crisis at all. You just have to figure out how to live into the baptismal vows that were made on your behalf and the baptismal vows that so many of us take each week, how to follow and walk and raise up our community, ourselves in the faith. The point is, no matter the scenario, if you don't ever get moving, you won't get to see that great deliverance. You won't get to see the rivers part as they open up a path to the promised land, which is still far off, but by the grace of God up ahead. If you don't get to moving, you won't get to experience the joy of community here at Westminster. Seek out the places you're being called here to volunteer in its elementary, or to provide a meal for WPCYG, or just to be a participant in Bible studies. If you don't get to moving, you won't be able to go with this congregation out on the road to the places you might never have led yourself, but the places which by the grace of God you are being called to share your gifts and resources and love and time. God is always the author of our salvation. We can't save ourselves. We can't orchestrate the world that we want. God is the one who will bring the kingdom about, who will bring it to our shores. But God is weaving together this mighty tapestry from our hopes and our fears, providing a pattern for all of our days. God is doing that. And the gift for us is not gazing at the beauty. It's following. It's going. Following God, we have an opportunity to labor in the kingdom, to work for liberation side by side. Following God, we have the opportunity to be served and to serve. We have an opportunity to know the one who leads us between two opposable forces, and the one who leads us in just the everyday moments of our lives. Faith is a paradox. It is stillness in movement. It is prayer and progress. It is trust between the wall of the sea and the chariots of the army, between our mornings and our evenings, and in all of our living. Faith is God's work, but it is our benefit. And it's not only an interior movement, a matter between us and God, you and Jesus all alone. That will land us in isolation on roofs, afraid of what comes next, afraid of the community around us. Faith is for those of us who file in on the road and seek to do God's will and follow after God's ways here and now, not only in some promised future, among this community and beyond it. Be still. Just don't forget to get moving to the places that God is calling you to go, to the peace that comes in service, and to the joy that comes with working in the field of the kingdom. Be still. Onward.